All right, and we are now live. Welcome everybody to Emerging Revolutionary War. We're sitting down today with Dr. Peter Henriques, a professor of history emeritus for George Mason University, the author of a few books about George Washington. He published first He Died as He Lived, a book about the death of George Washington. Also, about 10 or 15 years ago, Realistic Visionary, a great book about George Washington. And most recently, First and Always, about these are portraits about George Washington. So rather than just a biography that goes from the beginning of Washington's life to the end, Dr. Henriques really kind of picks some of the most fascinating and controversial at times aspects of Washington's life to really delve deep down in to try and discover who Washington really was. And I think there's some of the best books written about George Washington to really try to get to know who Washington was. So we're really, really fortunate to have you here with us tonight, Dr. Henriques. We are talking tonight. It is December 13th, and this is about this time back in 1799. Was close to the end when Washington started to get sick, and that he would eventually be his final illness. You can see the image behind me here of Washington on his deathbed. Tomorrow will be the anniversary, and as I just mentioned, one of the books you wrote is about the death of Washington. Can you tell us a little bit about the death of Washington to start us off tonight? Basically, what happened and what are some of the misconceptions I guess people have about his death?
Well, thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here and chat with you and your group. I was struck. I see behind you, you have the Junius Stearns famous picture of Washington on his deathbed. That in itself is a wonderful example of how the traditional image is and how inaccurate it is in terms of the actual portrayal. When you look at the picture, Washington is very casually, comfortably laying in bed, ready to be called to his heavenly reward. His wife is right by his at his bedside. In fact, she was at the back of her book. There's the back of the bed, not up near him. There were more black people in the room when he died than white people, which says something about slavery, though you'd never know it from the picture. I think when I got involved in the study of Washington, I think I was struck by a couple of developments. One, it was much more painful than I had been led to believe until I actually got into the study. The one positive thing about Washington's death, from his perspective, is that it was brief. He got very ill on the evening of December 13th. By the end of the evening of December 14th, he was dead. What basically happened, he got an infection, a special infection that enlarged his epiglottis, which is at the back of your throat, essentially slowly choking him to death. And no matter how brave you are, one of the tragedies of many of the people facing the end in COVID is the shortness of breath. If you can't get air, this is a terribly frightening thing. And it was a constant struggle to get air. And then the doctors, although with the best of intentions, made his suffering worse. They bled him 4 different times, took out 80 ounces of blood from his body. They did different purgatives and hot things around. They tried to feed him molasses and stuff. He almost choked to death. Along that line, the purgatives he gave him diarrhea and throwing up. I mean, it was a terrible day. And that was one of the things I was surprised. I was frankly a little surprised. There was a lack of religious context in his death. Washington, that's another source of a big topic, but there was no minister, no final words. Washington, Joe Ellis put it very well in a book after mine, where He said Washington died like a Roman Stoic rather than a Christian saint. But another thing that I entitled the book, quoting really from his secretary, Tobias Leary, died as he lived. Washington, his character came through in a very remarkable way. His courage, his ability to bear intense pain without complaint, his concern for others. He even asked his personal body servant, Christopher Shields, who'd been standing all day, to sit down, which I'm sure Christopher was happy to do. His organizational skill, he had Martha go to get the proper will to be sure that he had the right will and burn the old will. His last recorded speech of any length was his effort to ensure that his papers, Washington was very concerned about his papers. You see a man who's organized, courageous, sensitive to other people, and really some of his character shines through. He had faced death a number of times in the battlefield, and twice as president he was severely ill. Once during the French and Indian War, he referred to the grim keeper almost taking me away when he was in his 20s. But he always faced adversity with a sense of stoicism. At one time he wrote, he said, "I hope that I have enough fortitude to bear without murmuring any stroke which may happen to me," in his words. And he lived up to that courage. It was a terrible struggle, and he meant it in a way that showed the kind of character he had. With the passage of time, he's a hero. You want him to die gracefully. You want him to die as a Christian and calmly. And the story gets kind of, even when Mount Vernon had the celebration of the 200th anniversary of his death back in 1999, they downplayed this aspect significantly, but it is a factor.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting though too. I mean, you mentioned COVID, and it's obviously something everybody's aware of these days. This particular infection he had, do we know how he caught it? I know, the story is often he talks about going to dinner and there's snow clinging to his hair and he didn't change out. Did that have anything to do with him getting sick or not?
No, it didn't. He was out on December 13th, and it was a very nasty wintry day. He had undoubtedly had this serious infection. I forget, without looking at my own book, that the technical influenza type B, whatever germ it was. There were some stories of people in Alexandria dying this kind of death shortly before him. How long the infection was in his body, it certainly, the cold didn't have anything to do with. Indeed, being out in cold doesn't give you the flu. But if your body is weakened and there is an infection there, the fact that he was out in bad weather didn't change when he came home. That I think it's perfectly plausible that might have aggravated the situation and allowed a more serious illness to develop. That might have been the case. So it wasn't good for him to have not taken better care of himself. And Washington's was the kind of person, illness comes, illness goes. He's not going to worry about it. Even the night of the 13th, he was reading newspapers, and he was reading as well as listening with his secretary, Tobias Lear, and one of his arch adversaries, James Monroe, had just been elected governor of New York, governor of Virginia, and Washington was very upset about that. So he went to bed with a sore throat, not taking anything the night of the 13th, and yet within a day, he was dead. It was the major thing was that the swelling of the epiglottis was large enough. Now you have antibiotics, and if necessary, you could do a tracheotomy, which would open the windpipe. There was actually some serious consideration to do that. It would not have been successful, and it would have made his death even more more painful. So it's the kind of thing that it still happens. It's not a particularly common disease, but I do remember talking to a physician when I was doing the research. And he said, it is the lack of air that is so frightening. And if you picture yourself gasping, sometimes if you have severe asthma or something, you're fighting that I really hadn't thought much about it until our conversation here got me thinking of it. But many of the people who die of COVID have that same kind of clutching, desperate, which makes death, that much more difficult. I mean, the first thing you do is breathe, and the next thing you do is swallow, and you can't. With epiglottitis, he couldn't swallow. When they tried to give him some molasses syrup, he almost suffocated, spitting it up because of the blockage. So it's a sad story. But let's face it, it is 24 hours. It is not some debilitating Parkinson's disease or bone cancer or something like that made him suffer for a long period of time. He was very healthy right up till the time he died. The day or two before he died, he wrote, I forget how long, a letter to his overseer of suggestions that he wants Anderson to do during the next year. It's like 13 pages at the end of his papers. He was not thinking about dying. He had all sorts of plans for the future, even though he was conscious. He's 67 years old. He lived much longer than most of the members of his family. All of his siblings had died. And so much of his correspondence is, I've only got a short time left. And believe me, at the age of 83, I'm beginning to understand why he would say that from time to time. It's the time goes by fast. So he was conscious that his time was short, but not in a way that made him fearful or overly compulsive about it.
And it's amazing he's able to keep his composure, as you're mentioning about his papers and, of course, his wills. And even his fear of being buried alive.
Right. Yeah, I mean that his last request on this earth was to his secretary. I know it's not a fear in our day and age that if you're dead, you're going to be buried alive. It happened with enough regularity, obviously not often, but enough regularity. And I think it was John Jay's brother who had almost been buried alive. Washington was very conscious of it. I later learned a couple of other members of his family had the same kind of fear. It's kind of ironic that what Washington was most afraid of, being buried alive and not being able, he was actually kind of, in a sense, like being buried alive, not being able to get air into his system, and to be able to stay so calm, to ask Tobias Lear, I hope I'm not tiring you out in your efforts to care for me. That's a pretty special person who acts that way.
Yeah, no. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about this. So first of all, now you wrote about his death to start off, and then you've had this book, Realistic Visionary, and now you have a new book about Washington. I guess one of my questions would be, why have you chosen to spend so many decades studying George Washington? I feel like most people, when you hear, there's a new book, then they're just kind of, I think everything's been written about the man already. So what is it about
Washington? There's still lots to be written. There's going to be a lot of, it's like, has the last book been written about Shakespeare? No, there'll be, or Lincoln or some other, Franklin Roosevelt or other great historical figures. There'll be more written. I got my job at George Mason University. They were looking for a local historian, which really I'm not, but I tooled my vita as best I could to get that job. And one of the things I did as a local historian when I got the position, I suggested we have a local history journal. I called it Northern Virginia Heritage. We published 3 copies a year for 10 years, from 79 to 89. And during that period of time, I'm focusing on Northern Virginia history, and George Washington, of course. We even had signs. George Washington was a Northern Virginian because, you know, more than now, the rest of Virginia looked at Northern Virginia, you know, as enemy territory. And we were proud that George Washington was a Northern Virginia. So that got my focus more on him to write articles and look at him for the journal. And really, when I started to study him a little more than just my traditional view, I had a view of a man who is very impressive looking, very capable, admirable, but kind of dull, more a front man. He looked good, and he was manipulated by smarter people like Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson, but he didn't really have a strong force of personality. But when I actually started to study him, I said, this man is an extremely passionate, forceful, dramatic figure. You know, you don't end up being at the top of the chain just by winning a lottery. Washington had a lot of traits. The first chapter of my book, I try to give what I think the 10 combination factors that led Washington to be such a great leader. But I got studying him, and I found this guy is really interesting. And so the more I studied, the more interested I became. And obviously, the advantage of studying George Washington is people are interested in him. So I can be invited to Mount Vernon or Gadsby's Tavern or Colonial Williamsburg. I did my doctoral dissertation on a Virginia governor, John Battle. I knew a lot about him, but no one else gave a damn. So, you know, you're not going to be able to be invited to talk about it, or people won't buy books that you write about him. And I think over the years, you know, he has repaid me by, you know, you can't have great men over for dinner and chit chat with them, but by this kind of study, you do get a chance. And I make no claims to have mastered and really understand all aspects of George Washington by any stretch of the imagination, but I have learned a lot about him, and I admire him a great deal. As I mentioned in my book, full disclosure, I wear a medallion of George Washington around my neck. But that doesn't mean that I don't see that he's capable of making mistakes. He has certain character flaws. And my book is no hagiography. I'm really more amazed that, considering the shortcomings and challenges he had, that he was able to be such a successful leader. So once I got sucked in, I found the reward worthy enough to keep going.
Yeah, no, I think in your book, Realistic Visionary, right at the beginning, you talk about how also supremely important Washington is to the American story. Yeah, one of the quotes that or words that you spoke or wrote about that jumped out at me was, you know, the more that I study him, the more I admire him. And I think that that's rare for many historic figures, because I feel
it's always kind of tricky. Sometimes you can, and I have to guard against you. There's always a danger of where you become defensive about the person you're working at, and therefore whatever, you know, you're Biden's campaign manager, whatever the opposing side says, you defend your person. I'm trying not to let that happen with Washington. I got my doctorate from the University of Virginia back in the 60s, actually when all things Jefferson were holy back in those days. I was so surprised when I became a Washington scholar that Washington saw Jefferson as a very deceitful man at the end of his life. He didn't earlier. But there was a quote that Jefferson gave that I learned at UVA, and I've given it to my students and often say, is that here we're not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, or tolerate error as long as truth is free to combat it. And I, as an historian, I want to know, to the degree that I can, what is the truth. And there's some chapters in my book, like the Askell affair, a little known incident where Washington almost executes a British officer that had surrendered with protection. I'm quite critical of him. If some of his sensitivity to criticism and his excessive partisanship and his excessive lust for land and things, there are elements to criticize. But as you said, he's so important. I think it was a George Will editorial I read. I'm sure other people have said it, but in briefest essence, no George Washington, no United States of America. And I really believe that. We do not have to look like we do today, one country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We could look a lot more like the map of Europe, where we would have 5 or 6 or who knows how many different countries carved out. It's only because of Washington's remarkably nationalistic vision and his ability to keep the country together during the key early time. I mean, we admire Lincoln for saving the Union, but there would have been no Union to save if Washington had not been such a remarkable leader at the beginning.
Yeah, no, and I think that's, as I mentioned before we went live, part of my study has been in Trenton and Princeton battles. And, when you look at military campaigns of the Revolution, it was so important so early on. I think the exact same thing is true for Washington in just the sense that, without, his leadership during all these critical junctures.
And you mentioned the military side. I mean, you know much more than I, but I think his record is 3 wins, 9 losses, and a tie. That's not going to get you into the playoffs usually. But of course, in war, if you win the last battle, and the fact that he was able to keep the army in the field, that was the absolutely essential factor in allowing us to end up as a single nation. The British might have given up trying to reestablish control, but the idea that we would end up as a united country was very unlikely. And that's really where Washington and the love and admiration that people had for him and the way he was able to utilize the affection that people had for him as winning this miracle victory. Where it's a wonderful story of perseverance. I mean, Washington is one of the most determined people you could imagine. I forget. I think it was. Oh, it doesn't make any difference. Name slips my mind. It will come to me. One of the other leaders basically said that Washington has the kind of character that when other people give up because it's too hard, he keeps on going and is able to conquer situations which simply would have crushed the spirit of most people. And that's kind of really leading up to Trenton and Princeton. A lot of people would have been destroyed by the terrible losses and the chasing across New Jersey, etc. But he was able to persevere. And often victory is persevering. There's Alex Smith of the Washington Redskins is playing and has won 3 games. And I just went online. If you want a story of perseverance and courage, go on YouTube and look up Alex Smith and look at what happened to his leg, which was as gangrenous as a dead person would be, how he ever came back to be a professional football player. That's tremendous determination. That's the kind of character that Washington had, that he could be crushed, but not destroyed. And that's a great quality in a leader.
Yeah, no, and I just finished reading your new book, and that is First and Always. Definitely get a chance. This makes a great Christmas present, and it's not an extremely long book, but it's broken up into different chapters that really go into really interesting aspects of Washington's life. As Dr. Henriques mentioned, the Asgill affair, which is so little known. Like I said, I've been studying Washington for a long time and never heard about it until I read it in here. And there's many other really interesting things. And if you want to get a signed copy, you can actually go to the Emerging Revolutionary War blog, and you go on the blog post about this talk, and you'll actually be able to get Dr. Henriques' address. You can send him a check for $27.95, I believe, and you can personalize a copy and send it to you. But this is a great book, and you just talking about his courage and perseverance. You write about how you chose for the cover this Houdon's bust, and this more than any of the sometimes lifeless portraits and things like that. This really gets his that his face, you can really see that kind of person behind.
Yeah, I think I was very happy. I worked hard. My first cover, Realistic Visionary, I did not like. It was a traditional Peel portrait that is on so many covers. The Udone bust. I mean, Udone came to Mount Vernon for about a week or more. I forget the exact amount of time. Followed Washington around. Understood that he's a man, a passionate man, angered but in control of his passion. And if you look closely at the picture of the Udone bust, properly done, you'll see, if you look, his right eye is slightly raised, his nostrils slightly flared, his lips are pursed together, but the contours of his face are smooth. He's a man passionate but in control of his passion. And that's one of the key things to remember with Washington. He is an intensely passionate person. Most of the time, often for political reasons and because he wants an air of mystery, he seems cold and removed, but it is controlled passion. It isn't someone who doesn't give a damn or doesn't have passion. And I think Udone caught as close as we'll ever catch in an age before photography. When Lafayette came back to America in 1824 and saw the Udone bust, because he left, that's Mount Vernon's most valuable possession. He left the bust there. He went home with a life mask, which Washington put up with, putting all this clay and stuff to make a life mask, back to Europe to make the wonderful statue that's in the Capitol at Richmond. Lafayette saw the picture and the bust, burst into tears and said, "That's the man himself." And the family felt that this was the best likeness of him.
And if you get a chance to go see the original bust there at Mount Vernon, they have it situated, I think, exactly at 6'2.5" or whatever. Right. So when you walk up to it, you get as close a feeling of being close to the man as it right. was. But so what most people know, and you have a whole chapter in this book about myths about George Washington, and I feel like most people who haven't read a biography about George Washington maybe don't know much. The first things they'll know is he cut down a cherry tree. He has wooden teeth. Now you make an argument in this book. You kind of go through many of these myths, where they came from, how they were made up, and but you make the argument that these need to go away. That these are, I guess, essentially not helpful to really describing the character of Washington, whereas I think that they were originally created like by Parson Weems as a way to make this simpler for children or whatever, to get across the character of Washington. So I guess could you talk about like a couple of these myths, and why do you think that they need to go away?
There's I'll put my glasses on and just one just because John Rodehamel, there's a book, The Wonder of the Age by John Rodehamel, which is an excellent book. And I start my thing why it's important to discard the myths. He wrote this. He said, "The most successful statesman in American history is often best remembered as a boy with a hatchet or as a simple-minded prig kneeling in the snow to pray. A tawdry mythological excrescence oozing Victorian pieties and wooden teeth has gained a greater hold on our national imagination than the epic of Washington's indispensable leadership in the making of the great nation that probably would not have come to be without him." That's why we need it, because these myths, well-meaning as they might be, block. Abigail Adams made a great quote where she said, "Truth is the best eulogy for Washington." You don't need mythical stories, and many of the mythical stories lead us to, like he had no sense of humor is one of the myths that I look at when he did, that he was cold and unapproachable, that he was the father of a slave child, West Ford. Many of these myths give an inaccurate portrayal. The fact that he started the tradition that all presidents supposedly say, "So help me God," at the end of the constitutional oath when they become president. Washington did not do that, but it's widely believed that he did. And I try to explain why that's not the case, or that he's Hamilton's stooge. Hamilton's certainly a super influential person. Really, in my realistic visionary, I have a chapter on Washington and Hamilton, and I end up Hamilton being the indispensable man to the indispensable man. But Washington was never Hamilton's stooge. Hamilton had influence because he was brilliant, and he agreed with Washington's policy for the most part. So that these kinds of things block us from appreciating the flesh and blood man to the degree that we can. That's why I feel they need to be exposed.
Why do you think people cling on to these stories, I guess, the way that they have? Because I mean, there are plenty of real stories, as we mentioned, about Washington.
Well, I mean, the Parson Weems book was unbelievably influential. I can't remember how many editions it's been. It was the best-selling book for so long. It was used in school, and it has it's nice lessons. You tell the truth. You're an honest person. But the Cherry Tree has and reflects a lot of reality. Washington he was capable of telling lies, and did, but he's really a very honest person. And unfortunately, with our lack of knowledge, some tidbits of history just get passed down, and the Wooden Teeth and the Prayer at Valley Forge and the Cherry Tree are probably the three most famous that involve Washington. And for various reasons, they're widely repeated and widely known, and that's fine. But I think my view is always, what's the truth? What, as best you can, where does the evidence lie in these things?
So we need first and always to outsell Parson Weems so people can get the real story. Now, one of the really interesting chapters you have in this book too, and like I was saying earlier, in this portrait of Washington, you have different chapters that essentially could all be standalone essays that really delve deep, and one of them is just about Washington's mother. Which I think is interesting because as a historic figure, I feel like she's been characterized in certain ways throughout time. I guess from your research, it seems like you want to give her a little bit more benefit of the doubt from what you've read about her. Can you summarize a little bit about who Washington's mother was and how she's been characterized and what you found?
She's a very important figure in Washington's life. Washington's father dies when he's only 11 years old. Washington is the oldest of five siblings. He's only 11 when his father dies, and his mother is going to bring up these five children by herself. She'll never remarry. There's two kind of strands in history. The older strand was, if you go even now to her home in Fredericksburg still exists, and there's a sign, the home of Mary, the mother of, you expect it to be Jesus, and it's Mary, the mother of Washington. She has this kind of saint-like view, but the much more widely held recent view is the shrewish view that she is narrow, she's selfish, she doesn't care for her son, she tries to block his advancement, and so on and so forth. It's a complex picture, and Washington, I entitle my chapter "Complicated, Very Complicated," the relationship between Washington and his mother. And I try to look at it really in two phases. The first phase of Washington as a youngster, and then their relationship after he becomes a man of increasing fame and importance. And to me, one of the interesting things is, Washington's father was not top gentry. He was second-tier gentry. When he dies, he had married before he marries Mary Ball. He was married to Jane Butler, who had two sons, Lawrence, who's the possessor of Mount Vernon, another son, Augustine, who's at Pope's Creek. And when he dies, 60% of his wealth goes to his firstborn. So the estate is dramatically reduced. 5 children. They're not particularly well off. Washington is super ambitious, but Virginia is a highly patriarchal, hierarchical society. There's no way he could rise unless he won the support of people of influence. People most significantly could give others, but like William Fairfax, later on the governor, Robert Dinwiddie. And the reason he would not, and many other elders, Landon Carter, a whole host of people admired and liked Washington. You have to ask yourself, if he had been an oaf, if he had been a bore, if he had not had good character, these people would not have picked him up as they wanted to help him. And I think you have to give credit to his mother in shaping the kind of person and his drive, because Virginia in the slaveholding 18th century, was very easy to be decadent and lazy and drinking and gambling and so on and so forth. Washington's extremely disciplined from an early stage. And I think his mother deserves credit for that. Now, she's a difficult woman with her own needs, and she causes Washington a lot of pain and suffering. She always wants him to focus on her, and that's not easy when you're trying to win a war or govern a country. And I think, there's some pretty tough letters from him about how difficult it is to please her and so on and so forth. But he also admires her strength, I think. And I tried to develop in my book, there's a number of cases or bits of evidence that he did care for her, even though she's aggravating. And I end the book, they're in many ways, not by any means in all ways, but in many ways, they're quite a bit alike. And I try to show how that is the case.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating to look at how Washington, has these relationships with people around him, whether it's his mother, and then you have a whole really fascinating chapter all about Washington and his relationships with many of the Virginian founding fathers, and basically how those fractured over the years, mostly in the 1790s, which I think you characterized as such a politically divisive time, rivaled really only by the lead up to the American Civil War.
And our own time. I think we can actually put our own time in that extremely divisive period.
Well, so I guess could you mention, so did Washington break these friendships off with Jefferson or Madison or Monroe, Mason? Were these all strictly over politics, or why did
it is, I call it fractured friendships, and they're actually, I focus on 5 different Virginians, 3 of them presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. George Mason, his early mentor and the author of the Virginia Constitution and Declaration of Rights, and Edmund Randolph, who was the Attorney General, later Secretary of State, Governor of Virginia. And in each case, Washington severs his relationship with these men. And it's interesting. I can't obviously give the whole story now, but at the root, it isn't political difference. Washington would always take the view, and I think sincerely, you could disagree with me and we could be friends. You vote for Trump, I vote for Biden, but we can admire each other and be friends. And he wrote like Benjamin Harrison, who was one of the critics of the Constitution. And Washington wrote a very nice letter. Men's minds are made in different ways. That's to be expected, that people will see things different. Washington came to believe, rightly or maybe not always correctly, that these men seemed in their attacks or criticism of him to attack his character. Washington is so sensitive to anything that might impugn the integrity of his motive. You could criticize what he did, but if you criticize the reason why he did it, and this led to the breaks. And also, Washington was the most intensely nationalistic. His emphasis is on the United States of America, with the emphasis on united. I think it was, I forget whether it was, I think it was William Abbott, my professor at UVA and one of the editors of Washington Papers, said Washington was the least Virginian of all the Virginian leaders. He was a nationalist. He had told Edmund Randolph, according to the Annis from Thomas Jefferson, that if the Union broke up, Washington would go with the North. And he is a nationalist in the way that these other Virginians are not to the same degree, but he feels that they attacked him in ways that caused him to be critical of them.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to see, because I think we typically think of the founding fathers and it's kind of a monolith. So it's kind of interesting to see how their relationship.
I remember I used to start my classes on this, the founding fathers sitting around singing "We Shall Overcome" and holding hands. It's this kind of thing. When you look at it, and of course that's the human condition always. People have different views of the best way to achieve certain goals, and there's a great deal of friction and bitterness among the founding fathers. It's not only in our own time that people have different divisions, and it was kind of surprising to see the depth of some of the hostilities that developed, especially in the 1790s, especially after Jay's Treaty, which was such a important but divisive decision by Washington to sign a treaty with Great Britain to avoid war, but to allow Great Britain to get major benefits.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, when Monroe is pulled back and Monroe writes his whole published essay about the Washington administration, and you write about how Washington takes this and, writes in the columns these kind of scathing remarks here and there to everything. And I was just saying, when you read his remarks, they almost sound like tweets or something.
Right. He did not do that often. This is the most extensive marginalia he used in his writing, and it was the most bitter and sarcastic because Monroe attacked him, and interestingly, he just wrote this. He didn't say it to other people. Monroe's book was actually not very influential at all, but Washington got a copy and it hurt him. And he seemed that he needed the cathartic value of this is wrong, even though he didn't share it with anybody else. We only know it because the book is in his library, and then the experts, when they go through, find all this, and naturally they're very interested in whatever scribblings Washington would have. Unfortunately, Washington generally doesn't scribble, and his diaries. I hope my next project is going to be on the relationship between John Adams and Washington. And Adams, his diary, "Dear Diary, I hate this guy," and he pours out his soul. Washington, the temperature's 34, wind from the northeast at 10. Not much fun in terms of revealing the character in his diary that there would be in a normal person's diary.
Yeah, no. So sometimes, it makes it difficult to drill down deep into some of this stuff. So that's why I think it's one of the things I really appreciate about your writing in these books is attempts to try and be insightful, to think about some of these things. And we're never going to know everything, but to kind of get the thought process going, it's really helpful to read your thoughts on what these things could mean or what you could believe. But one of the really interesting chapters in here also deals with a subject that's been very much prevalent today, and that's Washington and his role in the institution of slavery. And now this I thought was really interesting because you look at it more so taking some individual slaves who worked at Mount Vernon and try and find out as much as you can about each one of these. I guess for this, my question for this is really, how, as you as a historian, how has it been trying to drill down to find out about the enslaved people's story compared to Washington, because as little as Washington wrote about his feelings and things like that, he did write a lot, as opposed to the story of Caroline or some of these other stories.
Yeah, I mean, one of of course, this the whole story of slavery and racism, and the two are connected closely. It's the great tragedy of America. It's the great tragedy of Washington's life. There's a corrosive chain of slavery and racism that snakes through the Republic right from the beginning, and it diminishes every life it touches. It diminishes Washington's life. And I can understand, if I were an African American myself, how the fact that Washington owned slaves would keep me from having a total admiration for him. It's a hard thing to forgive. And it's a sad, it is the saddest chapter. But I do feel that you have to judge people in our context. We can go into that if you want. The specific chapter, my goal in the book, I call it Lives of Their Own, a look at Washington, 7 of Washington's enslaved workers. Generally the concept of enslaved people, you just have a name on a list. You don't have anything about them. But because of Washington's remarkably aggressive record keeping and fame, we can actually piece partially stories of people like William Billy Lee, his first personal servant, and Christopher Shields, who replaces Lee, Oni Judge, who was Martha's seamstress and maid, Hercules, Washington's chef, Sambo Anderson, one of his major carpenters, Caroline, who was, and Charlotte, who were seamstresses. And you can get a flavor for the challenge they faced to try to live out their lives. And some of the stories reflect negatively on Washington. There's no question about that. It is a sad story. On the other hand, people sometimes don't realize they have the image of slavery as if they're people with whips moving around and people all cowering and working. And then they're surprised to learn that Washington gives his body servant, Christopher Shields, $25 to go to Pennsylvania to get a doctor who's famous for curing people who have been bitten by mad animals, which apparently they thought Christopher was. That Sambo Anderson, one of Washington's enslaved workers, owned a gun and hunted and sold things to George Washington and lent him his boat, which Washington always put back. That Washington gave actually salaries to Ona Judge and Christopher Shields at one time when they were president, tickets to go to the play and theater, allowed them to march around, that Hercules was able to wheedle permission to sell the leftovers in the kitchen, which he made a significant amount of money and was able to dress in very fancy clothes. I'm not in any way mitigating the horrors of slavery. I'm only saying it is complicated. It's not just this brutality. And Washington, the sad thing to me is, in this day and age, people, they follow William Lloyd Garrison, who was the great abolitionist of the 19th century. He said George Washington is writhing in the flames of hell. Why? Because he's a man stealer. And you put that, there's nothing you can put on the plus slide that will ever balance that fact. And a lot of people today, if we can't burn him in hell, at least we can knock his statues down. We can condemn him. And it feels good in one way to do that, but it's a false kind of, Philip Roth talked about the ecstasy of sanctimony. We feel good by criticizing supposedly superior people and bringing them down. I mean, if you think Washington's, his parents believe in slavery, Virginia society, the government, his Bible, his church, all the leaders, what would you expect as a young man? any more than you're brought up and you love your country. This is he ends up freeing all of his slaves that he could at the time of his in his final will. The only founding father to do that. I mean, the story's sad, but it is not a question of just no progress. Washington's moving in the right direction, and the people who say he should have moved further, and you can make that case. But if he had come out publicly against slavery, he would have lost his ability to govern. The country would have been divided and separated, and the slaves would still be slaves. And Washington's view was the Union is the most important thing. And he hoped that in time, slavery can be dealt with. And he wrote that we have to end slavery. We must do it. But he felt in the early stages, the effort to do it with the view of the government and stuff, it would have simply been counterproductive and destroyed the thing he really cared about, the Union. And you may criticize him for that, but I think you want to try to judge him within the context of the dilemma he faced and the society in which he was brought up in.
Yeah, no, I think, the idea of presentism is a real challenge with people nowadays. And I think it's interesting because, the title of the book is First and Always. I mean, do you think that Washington is going to be able to survive, this current, they're renaming schools, right, taking down statues, all sorts.
I'm confident that he will survive. If he doesn't, this country is in deep trouble. If he doesn't do that, and there is a danger of excessive political correctness that no one is pure enough. And when you really set up a system like that, and the presentism, I mean, most of the people who are very critical, this is not an exact analogy, but people support a woman's right to choose and the right to have an abortion. If you could imagine a system 100 years from now, 200 years from now, where the far right position that God, at the moment of conception, a human soul is born, any killing of that is the killing of a human person. Anyone who does it is a murderer. Now, if that was the view that everyone held, and then we look back and acted and saw what people said and did in 2020, would it be fair to say every one of those people deserves to ride in hell? They're murderers and they're worth. No, it's more complicated than that. We live in a system. I mean, there may come a time when the animals we eat, everyone would see it as absolutely barbaric. There are some people who see it that way now. But would you say everyone who has a steak or a hamburger is just some brutal, savage type figure? You could say it, but I think it distorts the reality. And that's what happens, and we want to be on guard against in looking back. And once you go down the system, that unless you're pure enough, once you start that, there's always a more radical position than the position you hold. I forget the person's name, but in the Iranian hostage crisis, one of the people that seized under Jimmy Carter and captured our diplomats was an American student who led the movement of capturing these evil people and holding them prisoner. A few years later, he was executed because he was not pure enough for the new stage in the Iranian radical government. It's a dangerous position to hold, and it just, to me, it just does not deal with the reality of the world we face. It makes you feel good. Ecstasy is sanctimony. It's, to me, Philip Roth used the term. It's a great term, I think, that people like to flaunt. Well, Jefferson's a racist, so therefore he's inferior to me, without looking at the remarkable accomplishments and talents and humanity and caring that these people had.
Well, and talking about what you were prior saying, wanting to defend these people, you quickly feel this need to, because all these people have been dead for over 200 years, and it's kind of it's easy to beat up on people who are dead.
It's hard for them to fight back.
Yeah. But anyways, we're getting close to the top of the hour. But I just want to thank you, Dr. Henriques, for coming on here and talking with us. The book, again, is First and Always, collection of essays. It's wonderful. Really drives down to try and find out who George Washington really was. And I think, what you find is at times a very complicated figure, but in the end, a great figure. And it's really, really fascinating. I'm glad that this scholarship's coming out even here in 2020. I guess, one of the last things is, I mentioned the Asgill affair is this kind of very little known subject. How many more kind of stories like this are kind of hiding in plain sight here about Washington? Do you think there's still more?
They're still producing. The University of Virginia, in conjunction with Mount Vernon, is producing the Washington papers. When they're finished, they're going to be 90 volumes, over 700 pages. Much of it is searchable online. It's amazing. I think if you pick Washington's relations with certain individuals, like Joseph Reed or somebody like that, and wanted to explore in depth, or a Benjamin Rush or different people, there's lots of little things. A book needs to be written on Washington's relations with women. I couldn't do it, obviously, and at my age, or probably maybe because of my sex, even, I don't know. But there's fascinating stories still to be left, and segments. And as we learn more from, for example, they just produced the latest volume. It's not actually out yet. I got a copy on the Benedict Arnold treason. And there's some things that were discovered in there that can sharpen up our knowledge of different aspects of history. There's plenty to be done. And even the same material looked at from different perspectives. And with the Founders Online project, where, for example, you want to talk about Washington and religious, type in the word Jesus and see how often he uses it, or the term hell. And then you can go to all the correspondence wherever Washington uses the word hell. You can go and read it. You can go on certain individuals. That opens up possibilities for all sorts of kinds of study with the passage of time. So there's lots to do, and I'm sure 100 years from now, people will still be talking about Washington, maybe in ways and focusing on things we had not thought of. We're so focused on slavery and race now. For a long time, it was no issue at all. Well, there'll be other issues that perhaps will then interest people, and then they'll study it. He will not. I found he will not disappoint if you take the time and effort to work on him. Certainly, I feel rewarded for the time and effort I've spent on this remarkable man.
Well, excellent. So, thank you again, Dr. Henriques, for coming on with us. Like I said, if you guys want to get a copy of his book, you can check out the blog post if you want to get a personalized signed copy. And of course, his other books that were previously published, Realistic Visionary. And if you want to know more about his death, he died as he lived, the death of George Washington. They're all excellent. So thank you very much, Dr. Henriques, for coming on tonight.
Thanks a lot. Bye. I appreciate it, Mark. Happy holidays to everyone.
Yes.